This is episode 135 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at castycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi. I'm Darren Freebury-Jones, lecturer in Shakespeare Studies at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
There are examples of bodies being dragged out of their tombs in country churches because of a dispute over priority in the church space. One family felt another family had claimed a part of the church for their tomb and they didn't have a right to it, so they just take it apart and throw out the body. And then we know about these things because they end up in court.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When William Shakespeare died, he left on his gravestone a formidable curse, warning anyone who dared steal his bones after death. You can see this curse today at his gravestone inside Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. And it reads, quote, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man who spares these bones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." I really want to say that last line in a piratey voice. It is sinister and even comical today when grave robbing seems like such a far-fetched idea. But for the 17th century, when Shakespeare was buried, stealing someone's bones seems to come up a lot. When it comes to analyzing Shakespeare's curse, how effective was it at deterring the theft of the graves? To explore the history of grave robbing, the rumors that someone could have stolen Shakespeare's skull, as well as to explain the tradition of gravestone curses in Elizabethan England, we turn to Shakespeare expert and professor of English at the University of Exeter, Philip Schwyzer. Philip Schwyzer is professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Exeter. He is author of studies including Shakespeare and the Remains of Richard III, archaeologies of English Renaissance literature, and literature, nationalism, and memory in early modern England and Wales. His research interests include death, memory, maps, and monuments in Shakespeare's England. Hello, Philip. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Shakespeare writes about grave robbing in his plays, and we know that grave robbing became popular in the 18th century. It was immortalized by classic Victorian novels and stories. But Philip, was the theft of your bones after death something that was an actual common practice for Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, no, not in the way that we're familiar with it from stories from the 18th and 19th century. That kind of grave robbing to supply fresh corpses to surgeons to dissect wasn't going on because surgery hadn't really reached that point in England. But there were other circumstances in which bodies could be removed from their graves. There are examples of bodies being dragged out of their tombs in country churches because of a dispute over priority in the church space. One family felt another family had claimed a part of the church for their tomb and they didn't have a right to it, so they just take it apart and throw out the body. And then we know about these things because they end up in court. In the 16th century, after the Reformation, you do get a sad number of cases of bodies being exhumed and abused, taken to pieces or thrown away as part of Reformation controversies. So the bodies of purported Catholic saints might be abused by Protestants and removed from their shrines. Then when you come to the reign of Queen Mary, who restores Catholicism, the bodies of Protestant martyrs were often taken from their tombs and abused. So it was a kind of tit-for-tat exhumation. They did come up with a nice solution to this. In Oxford at Christ Church Cathedral, where they decided to mingle the bones of their local saint, Saint Friedewald, with those of a Protestant woman who had died recently. And that way, each set of bones would protect the other. No one would abuse them because they wouldn't want to abuse bones that were from their own religious faction. Shakespeare, though, I don't think he really had to worry about that. He would have grown up hearing stories about that, maybe stories of St. Thomas Becket, who was said to have been taken from his shrine at Canterbury and his bones burned to ashes and dispersed on the winds. But there's no reason why Shakespeare would have feared that such a fate would have befallen his body.
Some of England's most notable poets are buried in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. As Shakespeare was certainly one of these notable poets, was his curse aimed directly at those who might try to relocate him after death? So maybe he wasn't concerned about robbing in the traditional sense, but was there a risk that he would be placed with other famous poets?
Well, that's a really interesting suggestion. Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey was really only getting off the ground at this point, or maybe you should say was only getting into the ground at this point. Chaucer's tomb had been there for a good while and then had been recently joined by the tombs of Edmund Spenser and the playwright Francis Beaumont. And after Shakespeare's death, a minor poet named William Bass wrote an elegy for him in which he suggested that Shakespeare should join Chaucer, Spenser, and Beaumont to make up four, and they should be the four, basically, great poets of England for all eternity, and the space would be theirs. But almost immediately, other poets responded saying there was no need for Shakespeare to be buried in Poets' Corner. Ben Jonson, in his elegy for Shakespeare, declares that Shakespeare is a monument without a tomb. He says there's no need to lodge thee by Chaucer or Spenser because Shakespeare's works are their own monument. And you get the same sentiment a little later from John Milton in his poem on Shakespeare, saying, "What needs my Shakespeare for his honored bones? The labor of an age in piled stones, or that his hallowed relic should be hid under a star-appointing pyramid." And again, there's the same idea. Shakespeare's plays are, in a sense, the greatest monument anyone could wish to have, so he doesn't need a big tomb in Poets' Corner. Whether he was even aware that some people would want to bury him there, I don't know. It's a possibility, I suppose.
In 2016, an archaeological team investigated the grave of William Shakespeare using radar technology. They scanned the grave, but they didn't disturb it at all. And they're the ones who famously discovered that the upper portion of the skeleton there had been disturbed. Philip, did someone steal Shakespeare's skull?
That was a real shock, wasn't it? That was a wonderful story. And it took exactly 400 years for someone to figure out a way of getting around the threatened curse on the slab, to find a way of looking at the remains without touching or moving the bones through a radar survey. That's the trick, to be able to look at the body without moving the bones. My understanding is that the radar doesn't show for certain that the skull is missing. All it shows is that the upper part, the western end where the head would be, has been disturbed, so they can't quite tell what's there. Now, that disturbance could easily have happened during relatively normal repairs to the chancel floor during the 19th century. Like most English churches, Holy Trinity Stratford was extensively remodeled in the Victorian period. But the evidence would also fit an old story in which Shakespeare's skull is supposed to have been stolen as a kind of grisly prank. This is supposed to have happened in the 1790s, but the first we hear of it is in a story, what seems to be published as a fictional story in a literary magazine in 1879 by someone calling themselves a Warwickshire man. I've read the story. To me, it looks like it is a work of fiction, that it's someone trying to be a sort of Warwickshire version of Thomas Hardy with a kind of slightly creepy story of country life, rather than real evidence that the skull was taken. But we can't know for sure because still no one has actually dared to lift the slab and look.
Now, when you go into Holy Trinity Church there in Stratford-upon-Avon and you look at not just Shakespeare's grave, but the other ones, his stands out for having this curse on it. So, Philip, was it a traditional part of funerary arrangements in the early 17th century for a gravestone to have a curse like Shakespeare's? No, it really was not traditional at all. And if listeners take away one thing from this podcast, just take away this point: curses on gravestones are anything but conventional in this period.
And still, if you look at many modern editions of Shakespeare's plays, they will say, well, this looks conventional. It's not necessarily written by Shakespeare. It could have been written by any local person who had a job writing epitaphs for tombs. But there's nothing else like it. There's nothing else like it in the whole period. The only other really undisputed example of an inscription threatening to curse someone who disturbs the body comes from, 1676. It's 60 years after Shakespeare's death. It's not far from Stratford, and it's almost a word-for-word direct quotation of Shakespeare's epitaph. So it doesn't seem like evidence of a local tradition or a convention. It just seems like someone copied Shakespeare's tomb in that one instance. Now, you do get very occasional examples of inscriptions threatening a curse on someone who damages the monument, on iconoclasts who might barge in and want to smash up all the little statuettes and so forth on a fine funerary monument. But that's a different matter, because that would really be a crime, something that someone should be punished for. But moving the bones in the course of what would really be the normal duties of the church wardens or the sextons, to threaten a curse on that is extremely unusual.
I've read that in England in particular, it's a common practice for graves to be reopened at some point after the initial burial to make room for additional bodies to be buried in the same location, due primarily to an overall lack of ground space in England. This multi-person gravesite practice even shows up in Shakespeare's Hamlet, as the skull of poor Yorick is uncovered while the gravedigger is preparing Ophelia's burial place. Philip, was Shakespeare trying to prevent sharing his final resting place with anyone else? Why would this matter to him if it was such a common practice?
Well, it's absolutely right that it was a common practice, and it had been since the Middle Ages, precisely because, as you say, grave space was limited if people had to be buried in the churchyard. In the Catholic period before the Reformation, there was a whole religious protocol for dealing with this. Once the flesh was gone, once it was possible to remove these dry bones from the earth and make room for someone else, they would be reinterred in a part of the church called the charnel house. And although charnel house sounds very nasty, it was actually a kind of sacred space where these now anonymous bones would still be part of the church community and prayed over and so forth. But after the Reformation, it was no longer considered appropriate to pray for the dead, and it became a much more fast and loose matter of getting these bones out of the earth to make room for someone else. Maybe they'd be thrown away. In some cases, there's evidence of their being used for fertilizer. And that's a good deal more disturbing than knowing that your bones will be put in a little room and prayed for. Some people dealt with this anxiety by having wooden or lead coffins. The fashion for coffins really takes off in this period. Shakespeare, however, chose unusually a curse rather than a coffin. I do think you're right that it's really perceptible in Shakespeare's works, this concern with what happens to the body after death and the possibility of it being removed from its grave. It's there in Hamlet. Hamlet seems to think that what's being done to Yorick now is actually worse than death itself. He says, did these bones cost no more the breeding but to play at loggats with them? You know, it's bad enough to die, but then to be turned into a kind of football or whatever is a fate worse than death. And likewise in Romeo and Juliet, you have Juliet's nightmarish vision of what will happen when she wakes up in the crypt. She thinks that she may go mad and start to dismember her own ancestors and knock out her brains with some great kinsman's bone. So Shakespeare's imagination keeps going back to these ideas of the terrible things that can be done to bodies after death. I think it is a particular fixation of his, to be honest.
You've addressed a couple of reasons why Shakespeare would have feared or despised this kind of posthumous exhumation. But when I was looking into this, here where I live in the southern United States, it's a commonly held belief, and I don't want to say everyone, I don't want to too widely apply this generalization here, but something I've come across living here is the belief that the body of the dead is to remain undisturbed because it will be resurrected when Christ returns. And some Protestants even oppose things like cremation on similar religious grounds. And I wonder, Philip, were there similar religious reasons for Shakespeare to be afraid of posthumous exhumation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. People did worry about this, but Christians in Shakespeare's day were always reassured that God's angels would find them, would find all the matter that had made up their bodies, no matter how scattered it was, no matter where it lay. Shakespeare's contemporary, John Donne, who was both a poet and a preacher, in his sermons and his poetry, he comes back to this again and again. At one point, he writes in a sermon, "Legions of angels, millions of angels shall be employed about the resurrection to recollect their scattered dust and recompact their ruined bodies." And Donne is there to remind us that there's no way you can escape this fate of being turned into dust, of being, wafted around on the breeze. No matter how much you try to keep yourself apart, ultimately you're going to be mingled with everybody else. And Donne actually finds something to sort of celebrate in that. It's a kind of community of dust. But Shakespeare clearly wasn't having it. Shakespeare wanted to keep his dust. And he does say on the tomb inscription, he speaks of the dust enclosed here. So he is thinking of himself as having turned into dust, but it's still going to be his dust separate from everyone else's dust.
Some historians have argued over the fact that Shakespeare's grave is actually very small. By some accounts, it's even too short to have contained a human adult. Philip, is Shakespeare's grave abnormally small?
Well, there was always that possibility, but I think the radar scan just a few years ago has shown that the area with air pockets beneath it, the area where a burial would have been inserted, is the normal length, the length for a normal body. It's short because it's right up against the altar step in the chancel, so there may not have been room for a normal-sized slab. But to be honest, the way they move things around in churches over the centuries, the position or size of a slab is never a very good indication of what lies underneath.
At great risk of feeding a conspiracy theory with this next question, I do want to ask, along with the curse to anyone that opens it, saying, do not open this and investigate what's here, is it at all possible that Shakespeare was never actually buried there in the first place?
Yeah, well, and that conspiracy theory, I think it is a conspiracy theory, but it has been around for a long while. And in a way, those poets I was mentioning, like Ben Jonson and John Milton, who say, Shakespeare doesn't need a grave, his works are their own monument, almost seems like a kind of clue to the idea that maybe he doesn't have a grave at all.
Right, they're not helping.
Yeah. Personally, I think that he is buried. There's no reason to think that he isn't buried in Holy Trinity, Stratford. I think it wouldn't be all that surprising if people ever actually opened up what's underneath the floor to find that he's not there where it sort of says he is, because, as I said, the position of slabs is often a very poor guide to where the burial actually took place. He could be, 10 yards away in another part of the church. That sort of thing happens all the time as things get moved about. But I think probably he is somewhere within the church walls and under the church floor.
Well, let's compare Shakespeare's curse then to other contemporary gravestones. Did any of Shakespeare's family, fellow playwrights, or other people who died within that general time period of the mid-17th century use warnings or curses on their tombs?
Well, as I say, the curse against someone who would interfere with your body, with your bones, is sort of unique to Shakespeare, as far as I can tell. I haven't come across anything that closely resembles it. There's another sort of warning, which is quite common. We find versions of it, for instance, on Shakespeare's wall memorial in the same church, saying that Shakespeare's fame lies in the pages that he wrote rather than in this tomb, and will last much longer than any tomb can. That kind of sentiment, which is very common, sometimes takes a form of a warning or even a provocation to someone who might want to damage or destroy or investigate the tomb. Shakespeare himself is said to have written an epitaph for a member of the Stanley family in the village church of Tong, in which he writes, "The memory of him for whom this stands shall outlive marble and defacer's hands." So it's almost like a kind of provocation or a taunt, saying, go ahead, try to deface this tomb. You won't be getting at the fame of the man who's buried here, because his works, his deeds in life will always be famous. But that's a different kind of warning than the kind that Shakespeare puts on his own grave.
Well, I know we would love to explore this topic further and to look into it more. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
Well, one great starting point for thinking about Shakespeare and death is a short book by Simon Palfrey and Emma Smith called Shakespeare's Dead. And of course, the title is a pun. It means Shakespeare is dead, but also the dead of Shakespeare, the dead in Shakespeare's plays. That came out in 2016, which was part of that 400th anniversary of his death. A more serious historical study of death and burial in the period is a book by Peter Marshall called Beliefs and the Dead in Reformation England. And I'd also recommend that people have a look at the website of the Church Monument Society. It's a wonderful organization that both preserves and studies monuments and churches large and small across England. In particular, they have a Monument of the Month on their website. And they have at different times featured both Shakespeare's grave slab and his wall memorial in that church in Stratford, as well as many other memorials from the period that are worth investigating.
Those are great resources. We will link to all of these as well as Philip's work in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you go there to see links to all of those. Philip, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Right. Well, maybe it's just because of what we've been talking about, what I've been thinking about, but the choice that springs to mind is a massive early modern book by John Weaver called Ancient Funeral Monuments. It's one of these huge folios of about 600 pages long. It's intended to be a complete survey of all the epitaphs and monuments in England. And of course, that's one of these impossible Renaissance projects that never gets very far. I think he covers about 3 counties. But still, partly because he is so interested in everything and so easily caught up by anecdotes and funny stories he's heard about the dead and poems that he thinks he's going to insert. It's a book that you can get lost in, and it takes you places you never expected, often nothing to do with anything to do with funeral monuments. And it's also just very long, which is what you want on a desert island, I think.
I would think so. Yes, you'd be very well set up there and have tons of little tangential projects to keep you busy for sure. So what's next for you, Philip? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm sort of moving on. I'm moving on from Shakespeare's grave to Shakespeare on other people's graves. I've got a project that's really just in the early stages now of looking at what I'm calling Shakespeare and the Anglo-American way of death, which is really investigating how quotations from Shakespeare and references to Shakespeare get incorporated into inscriptions on headstones, into funeral sermons, into obituaries. So Shakespeare actually becomes part of the way we're thinking about the process of death and remembrance and the way we process that in our society. And I'm also interested in how Shakespeare gets misquoted on headstones, because this seems to happen all the time. These wonderful bad quotations or sort of reimagined bits of Shakespeare that you find on headstones that really tell us maybe more about the period in which they were made and the people who wrote them than a straight up quotation could.
Well, that sounds very exciting. I know we'll look forward to seeing that project come to life. Thank you, Philip Schwyzer, for being here and talking with us about gravestone curses. This has been a fun conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
To find links to the resources Philip mentions in today's episode, along with more information on Philip himself and how to connect with him, please visit the show notes. Find more history on William Shakespeare, images, and resources at CassidyCash.com/episode 135. That's CassidyCash.com/EP135. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right, That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into that Shakespeare life.